As we start out a new decade, I thought it would be cool to take a look and have a discussion about Guild Wars 2's biggest problems, as I see them, of the modern era of the MMO. And maybe while we're at it, suggest some fixes at the same time. So I've got a list here that I've given some good thought. Now, this is not every single problem with the game. MMOs and Guild Wars 2 in particular are massive with a huge number of different divergent areas that can have any number of problems with them. I just want to look at the big picture, the product in general. There's nothing really short-term here or nebulous either, like communication is one of the problems, or patch frequency. I'm not interested in that stuff that can change month by month, but rather the broad things that could possibly be holding the game back. Maybe you'll find you agree with a few of them. So thing number one on my list, and this is in by no means an order of severity, though I believe this one to be probably the single most prominent thing, is what I'm calling non-meaningful character progression. To the layman, we could maybe refer to this as simply the topic of rewards. So what I mean by this is that a lot of people who play Guild Wars 2 get into it, find that they are very soon lost and have nothing meaningful to continue working on to build their character up and give them that thirst, that sense of direction for what to do next in the game. So as soon as that happens, they might try an alt or two, but they're liable to leaving. So this is a multi-pronged issue as far as Guild Wars 2 is concerned, and one big fundamental part of it is by design. So I would give the devs a free pass about this, and that is the idea of statistical progression. Most MMOs solve this problem, most RPGs in general even, by simply putting you into a rat race. You beat the game and you have a certain amount of strength, you can do optional side stuff at the end and get stronger, then you wait for some kind of update which will make you stronger still, some kind of big expansion later which will make you stronger, and the content continues getting more and more difficult, requiring that you go through all of these hoops. And as silly and weird as that sounds, it gives people a very real sense of purpose and direction. It's enjoyable, I would say, for the average gamer. It's a loop and a cycle that if you end up playing a lot of these kinds of games, you can get really sick and tired of, and that's where Guild Wars 2 deliberately comes in and says, here's a game where you can enjoy yourself in an RPG, but we won't do that to you. We're not going to keep creeping the stats. We have one little area of the game that's fractals that has this sense of gear progression, but mostly you'll do it once, maybe twice, and then it's just a matter of money. And for the rest of the game, you're never really going to feel like you're getting weaker. We'll give you new options, but we won't supersede previous ones. Hell, some of the Berserker gear that you built in 2013 is still exactly useful for a massive number of builds here in the next decade. That's Guild Wars 2, and it's by design. A lot of people bought into that, so it would be a bit foolish for me to ask the game to change in this way, but it is a fundamental reason why most people then have non-meaningful character progression, because if that's the main thing they're looking for in games, they need to get it somewhere else. And so where's the somewhere else in Guild Wars 2? Well, back during the Guild Wars 1 days, and certainly the early Guild Wars 2 days, cosmetics was the answer. And this was effectual for Guild Wars 1 through its entire life, I would say, and for Guild Wars 2 for a good long while. But nowadays, cosmetics have started to fail. In fact, I would say over the past few years, cosmetics have been failing. Why is this? Well, a lot of the more long-term invested fans of the game have the legendary weapons, the legendary armor, the legendary trinkets, the infusions, the auras, the special skins that they already want. There are only so many gear slots you can equip onto a character before you find something you're really proud of, and you're just not that excited to have another alternate set. Sure, with the new build templates and equipment loadout specifically update of 2019, it does feel like there's more wiggle room with the fashion wars. Maybe you already have lots of legendaries, but now you want even more to fill out a different template, but it becomes an increasing minority of players. People just aren't into this stuff. We've seen with the most recent saga, the devs pushing the echelon even further, having one of the cosmetic rewards you get for beating the New Living World patches being emotes, but we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. Just how do the developers motivate you to get new skins when the ones you already have are super badass and well made? Well, try to make them bigger, try to make them shinier, and we've seen a lot of skins go in this direction over the recent few years, completely debasing the initial aesthetic that the game had. Compromises like this have to be made though, in order to keep getting sales on the gem store and actually making sure people do achievements and do get those rewards that are being implemented and feel like they're meaningful. We've had chairs be added as a new option, we've had basically all of that novelties UI, we've had the idea of mail carriers, of gliders. After 8 years, there's really not much room yet, and the truth is that most people don't have statistical meaningful progression, and most people aren't that enthused by cosmetics anymore, as far as I see. There are a few other systems in the game too that should give you that meaningful character progression. Elite specializations were initially implemented with the first expansion to be a progress to build up, but after community complaining that they couldn't get the stuff really quickly, that's not really anything. The mastery system is another feature that is supposed to give you meaningful character progression, but is really only worth a couple of hours of gameplay with a new release at most, where people get way too much experience and finish these things off straight away. Even if you don't have the recent masteries finished, the devs are often baking into the design of masteries such that they're cooperative. It doesn't matter that you don't have the mastery, the 20 other people around you do have it, so it doesn't matter that you didn't get it. It's just not a meaningful system. And finally, I would say, Guild Wars 2 is a game that really lacks the idea of being able to reset your progression. In many other games, there might be a new league, a new season arrives, there may be really tangible, exciting reasons to create alt characters. In Guild Wars 2, you get very little playtime out of this stuff, or the features aren't there at all. I myself have loads of characters, and they're all well geared, ready to do whatever task I want them to do, but does that mean I had lots of meaningful hours of playing the game and adventures for each of them? No, they were all done pretty much in moments, and the amount of content I'm getting from the game bottoms out fast. The last gasp resort, as far as I see it, from the devs to try and add some meaningful progression for players is that of achievement points, which sure, when you get invested in them, can be pretty fun, but most players feel like they'll never be able to get a lot of the achievement points they missed and just aren't into the system in the first place. Truly, if you become invested in collections and achievements and those things you do consider to be fun content, the value you get from Guild Wars 2 is insane, but so few do. So that's problem number one as far as I see it with Guild Wars 2, the non-meaningful character progression. And if I were looking to resolve this as we go forward, I'd be looking seriously at the mastery system and player motivation for actually making alts. There are a ton of big grandiose ideas you could have, of course, but I'll keep it simple for now. The second of Guild Wars 2's biggest problems I want to identify is that of unengaging gameplay in the living world for those most enthusiastic of fans. There is a simple fact about this product, and I'm sure it happens with many MMOs, but Guild Wars 2 I'm sure suffers much more with its complex build system and particular flavour of action combat that has been so applauded over the years. And that is this: there is a massive difference between a new player, a casual player, and an enthusiastic player that really focuses on their gameplay and learns about the game and the build that they're using. The devs themselves acknowledge that there was somewhere in the region of 10 times more damage output being done by invested players compared to most anyone else. There is a wild difference, not just because of gear and the difference between someone being well geared and poorly geared, but in understanding and application of how the game works to tackle its challenges across the player base. What this means for ArenaNet, who are trying to make content everyone can feasibly do and not frustrate the average gamer, is that they have to cater, or have been at least for many years now, to the lowest common denominator when making their standard content. Most of what ArenaNet focus on is Living World, and most of Living World, a huge proportion of it, is designed to be beaten by even the poorest of players. What does that mean for the invested players and those who are really looking for something to tack onto? Well, Living World is extremely boring, and ArenaNet are in a very dangerous position, and have been for a long time, where many of their most enthusiastic and dedicated of fans don't enjoy Living World. In fact, they sneer at it, and they begrudge it, and the efforts that ArenaNet have put into it over time, despite the fact it's probably the most profitable and highly played section of the game. At this point in 2020, you'd be very hard pressed to find a champion of the Living World somewhere on a discussion forum, or on a YouTube video like mine. Without that small but crucial top-end endorsement of an entire game type, very little enthusiasm will trickle down and encourage new people to come to the game and enthusiastically play the Living World, because why would you? All the people you look up to really don't care for it. And so Guild Wars 2 enters this kind of toxic, scary place where the main ambition of the developers is being glossed over or actively hated on, and the main thrust of the MMO is being debased. If I were to attempt to fix this issue, and I really do think, as with everything on this list, that it's a crucial one, I would want ArenaNet to find a way to bridge the gap between the more enthusiastic players and the more relaxed ones. I would find a way for the developers to have more confidence in the capabilities of their audience so that the experiences they're offering are more balanced for everyone to enjoy and are more uniform while they're at it. Currently, ArenaNet tries to solve the issue by, instead of providing much standard combat, they do more dialogue stuff, or they try to give you mini games and new skill bars and specific things, but that's all crazy amounts of development effort that needn't be there. When it's appropriately balanced, Guild Wars 2's combat is good. They don't need to do much more than throwing enemies in hallways and having bosses with fairly simple mechanics, as long as it's well balanced. All that other time could be spent on making these patches longer or better in other ways. Unifying the player base's skill would certainly be a challenge. After 8 years, many people have different conceptions about what the game is or how they should tackle it. And sadly, for most of them, they were trained by the core Tyria experience that auto-attacking, never really dodging, and just interacting with items every now and then is enough. ArenaNet need to train people away from that, and maybe, for new people coming in as well, look at core Tyria itself. Beyond just trying to get the player base onto a more even footing with one another, filtering tutorials around the game can only do so much after all. I also believe in the implementation, however rudimentary, of some kind of difficulty slider. Call what Living World currently is story mode. And maybe you shouldn't get any titles or big rewards from story mode. If you want to get the rest of the stuff, let's have some enemies that don't die in 2 hits. Let's have some enemies that will actually have the potential to take us down, and call that something of a harder difficulty mode. It doesn't need to be many, there just needs to be something encouraging for the random casual players to look at that harder mode and maybe engage in it every now and then. I am actively disappointed whenever a new Living World patch comes out lately, trying to play it cooperatively, because as a co-op group of reasonably decent players, we annihilate all of the interactions in the game so fast, I'm not having any fun. That needs to change. The next crucial issue with Guild Wars 2 I would also levy at the Living World, and that is on the topic of replayability. Now, I have less to say here, but let's set the stakes. Guild Wars 2's main updates, the most significant regular ones, are Living World. They're coming at a rate of about once every 2 months right now, and they have a reputation of being a thing you can beat in a matter of a few hours, a single day, or completely 100% them in 3 or 4 days. For some of these episodes, that is totally true, and ArenaNet need to pay much more care about how much playtime they're getting from people when they release a Living World patch. They need to be more conservative with those optional achievements for the people who are really going to try and complete everything. I personally do not believe it is healthy for ArenaNet to signal to their user base that they only need to play the MMO for 1 week every 2 months. That is not enough to sustain people's entertainment and call Guild Wars 2 their home or their main active game. People will defect away. I do believe that the core main story stuff should be able to be reasonably well completed in a day or so without any annoying arbitrary grindy gates. But if they're putting decent rewards in, and that could be achievements, that could be skins, that could be any number of things which they do actually put the development effort in for, it should be a real task for players to get them. I shouldn't 100% a patch in just a couple of days. And no, this isn't coming from a player who's hyper efficient and zergs around everywhere. Believe me, people could do them even faster. Even I, who tries to get as much value as possible, find this stuff runs out too quick, and it's because ArenaNet are too lenient and too fearful of community retribution, because God forbid someone has to play the game for a little while. Beyond just this, I believe Living World has, for the past few years, had a serious problem where new releases are invalidating the importance of previous ones. Rather than every new update expanding Tyria and making it feel like it's an increasingly large and exciting world to be in, it feels instead like Mostly, there's just an active player base that's getting shunted forward to the next thing, and no one ever really looks back. That could be resolved with some serious efforts to add things to previous maps after they were already out. This new saga is returning to the idea of expanding on maps, which I'm very happy with. But why is it that in episode 1 or 2, we haven't really seen much go on back in the Grothmar Wardowns? Why am I so confident we'll never see another change for Season 3 map or a Season 4 map? These places will just wither away in our memory, and it makes the game very difficult to recommend for new people, because what am I going to do? Tell you to play through a bunch of stuff I'm fairly certain there aren't many people around? Sure, the game can be done in a largely solo environment, but the game could be doing much more. I'd love to see the devs look back at some earlier content, at least every now and then, and give people more meaningful reasons to explore it, not just some big reward or mount at the end of the season, like we saw with the Sky Scale or the Legendary at the end of Season 3. What I think a lot of people don't realize is that ArenaNet do put a lot of stuff in with the living world, but the way that everything is being packaged in this MMO makes populations run through the stuff like water through a sieve and not really invest as much as they could or should be, and any other well-crafted online experience probably would be doing so. The next issue I want to talk about is the handling and treatment of the gem store. So I think at this point, it's pretty clear nobody likes microtransactions, but most of us accept that that's become the industry standard, and they're here in Guild Wars 2 also. I would also be a fierce defender of ArenaNet's gem store in that it has not, over all these years, become truly pay to win or pushed its boundaries too poorly. But the gem store these days has a very bad reputation. This is mostly because for every playable patch we get, there tend to be several gem store releases with all kinds of new skins that often end up looking better than the ones we can earn in-game. A lot of people begrudge that, and I don't blame them whatsoever. I think it's very easy for me to sit here and say, well, to fix this problem, all they need to do is have all those gem store releases be in-game. But clearly, the money has spoken, the market has spoken, people are using the gem store, and it is profitable for ArenaNet to operate this way. So instead of lecturing on that or trying to magic up more resources and more assets that they can put into the game to compete with the gem store, I'll say this instead. If the gem store has to be this way, and the rewards are destined to be better and so much prettier quite often than the things we work hard for through the conventional releases, ArenaNet should really try to remind people that the gem store does not mean real-world money, and much of what is available there can be acquired through in-game currency. I personally, for all these years, have been much more lenient of the gem store because I'm well aware of that fact. Quite often, when I see a gem store update, I just feel like that's a thing totally accessible that I can get without busting out a credit card. That is because you can buy gems with gold. But most players have either forgotten this or are willfully ignorant of the fact. If when the gem store releases came out, they saw in plain English, hey, this is worth this amount of gold, and not necessarily just a gem price, I think they'd be much more tolerant in general. I think the reason that ArenaNet don't make this too obvious is that, of course, it would probably lead to some loss of real-world revenue in the store, and that's something they're not going to want to mess with. But I cannot overstate the amount of goodwill that would come towards this game and people deliberately choosing to support this game if basic facts like this were more evident to the player base. Some of you will argue that the gem store isn't bad because it's real-world money, because you can get it in-game anyway, but because a lot of the gem store skins are cool and we don't get real content from them. But I don't really find that to be a compelling argument by 2020 either. We've seen over the years, ArenaNet had multiple forays into releasing items on the store that rather than just immediately getting access to, you had to do some kind of small adventure. You had to wander around dealing with the Skrit in Skritsburg to finally get the reward, or you had to mess with Black Lion agents. Sometimes the feature itself that you're buying is content, like with the mini Basenji or the Sky Scale that we saw in some of the recent patches. What about the gardening update? It seems though if ArenaNet do that and they tie content to the gem store, things go even worse for them. People don't like the idea that content has a paywall in front of it, whether it's real-world money or whether it's in-game money. And that stuff just hasn't sold that much better that we see them doing a lot of it. So I'm not sure that's the real story. The real story is people have to play a lot of the game to earn a lot of the gold to get through this paywall, or they can bypass it with their money. That's the whole story. It shouldn't be that it's because the gem store is this evil thing ruining all your fun in the game. But for many people, it is. And no matter how healthy this thing is compared to other MMOs, people don't like recommending this one because of it. The second to last major issue I want to highlight in this video is the lack of meaningful, cooperative-minded features in the game. Now, this is a rather broad topic, but obviously, having co-op gameplay in an MMO is extremely important. Having communities within the game and tangible, real reasons for interacting with other people is paramount to the success of a game like this. So how does Guild Wars 2 do? Open world is admittedly full of players. Even here in 2020, you can walk back to random core tier maps, even those Season 3 and Season 4 maps I mentioned earlier, and find plenty of players around. It won't take long. And I'm sure ArenaNet is very proud of this and feels like they've done enough on the MMO front. But I couldn't disagree more, because the interactions you have in these scenarios are entirely empty and shallow, with nothing deeper there than maybe acknowledging a person exists. There is no talking, eventual friend making, and then from that, traveling to new areas of the game you didn't know about, but the other person did. So, where are those moments in Guild Wars 2? Well, there are numerous features that should offer it, but let's go through them. Guilds. You'd think, since it's in the title of the franchise, the devs would have a little bit more get up and go about this area of the game, but they really don't. For the majority of the MMO's life, they haven't. It is true that, 5 years ago, they introduced a lot of beautiful infrastructure to guilds. They added the idea of the guild missions with all of its various types, the treks, the puzzles, the bounties, the challenges, but none of that has been expanded on for, half a decade? Yes, there are some guild updates, like the new hall that was added with Path of Fire or the decorations, but none of that really gets people playing together. As I mentioned in point 1, this game has a real problem with reward incentive, so people don't go for the guild currencies, and they're certainly not interested in doing the same thing over and over and over again for 5 years straight. So where has that content been? ArenaNet just won't do it, so why would I bring you into my guild? Well, there's not much reason to, really. Then you have the so-called difficult endgame features. Now, the poor tutorialization and the catering to the lowest common denominator difficulty I mentioned earlier in this video cause there never to be much of a thirst for challenge or an understanding of the combat in your average person. So whenever the devs have done a feature that is cooperative and challenge, like dungeons or fractals as we have, like raiding, well, they never had a very high population very quickly, and on seeing this low population, the devs never ran with it. You may actually call that a smart move, I certainly would. Maybe if they went long enough and hard enough, eventually those areas of the games would become very populated. But at the outset, it was too much work for too little gain, and now, where are we in 2020? Well, fractal updates do come, but are increasingly rare. Raiding updates do come, but are increasingly rare, with people throwing doubt as to when these next things will ever even come out. The result of this? Even less meaningful co-op stuff, even less reasons to have a community, and while the casual user base never really moved to those areas, the top end of the user base is now actively moving out of those areas because they aren't getting the updates regularly enough. Living World seems like an obvious place to add some meaningful cooperative gameplay, but again here, the devs really don't. Not in the story journal. They seem to think that the Zergy, very basic open world stuff is all that the MMO needs. And again, I disagree. As I mentioned earlier in the Living World section, if you do play story journal stuff co-op, it actually makes the game worse, because you have even less to look at and less to see before stuff suddenly dies. The devs don't even try to make this stuff scale. Some patches certainly do have variant story things, and supposedly episode 2 of Icebrood Saga will go further with that, but for many years now, I've not been impressed. Lastly are the other two branches of the game, World vs. World and PvP, the competitive areas. Since not becoming smash successes right at launch, perhaps due to them not being ready, these have always had fairly marginal populations, but just like with those other aforementioned scenes, these two haven't had the priority focus Living World has, and they too in general are draining out, some of the only other places to get really good co-op gameplay. World vs. World in particular has its own issue, where it's diminishing since the players announced the Alliance feature, and it's been multiple years it hasn't come, so people are waiting on that, and now the game type's in the back of their minds, but we'll see where that goes. I suppose the newest saga has attempted to rectify the issue somewhat with strike missions, something of a bridge feature from standard Living World stuff into these other areas, these cooperative features. But I'm afraid strike missions are just too unintelligently synced into the rest of the release, and many casual players don't even know that they're there, let alone that they could go for them and get rewards. The result? There's not much co-op going in Guild Wars 2. If I were ArenaNet and looking at what they are prioritizing on, the number one thing I would start on is getting meaningful co-op into the core Living World releases. Perhaps tie it into my aforementioned higher difficulty mode for story journal content, and then go from there. But this is an area of the game that needs a lot of work. The final major issue that I see with Guild Wars 2 of today is really not even a problem with the game itself, but rather the extra information around the game that has affected how people interpret it and whether they want to get invested. And that is what I would call a fear for the game's direction. Last year, we had a slew of bad news from the studio, hearing about layoffs and the fact that the studio was not actually profitable in the way that it was running. As bad as that news was, the real disaster as far as Guild Wars 2 was concerned, in my opinion, was the revelation that ArenaNet had been working on other games. And those other games, they had nothing to show for and didn't have anything to get people excited about or to justify their experience. So since that time, a lot of people feel like Guild Wars 2 isn't ArenaNet's main ambition or priority, so why invest in the MMO? And while you may be able to swallow that pill with any other studio announcing to you a new game, in this situation, people find it very hard as they don't have some kind of cool trailer to get them hyped, they don't have some new interviews or ideas from the studio to really rally behind. It's just empty, awkward silence and a sulking elephant in the room that maybe ArenaNet doesn't care as much about Guild Wars 2 as you thought they did. I think anyone who really looks at the game industry and really takes the time to think for themselves could have always expected ArenaNet to be working on other stuff, and maybe even have acknowledged that somewhere along the line it had gone wrong since 2012. But the scale of these layoffs and the silence that's followed them, I think has really rocked the boat about this game's future. Without a proper announcement from the studio that people can really believe in, that Guild Wars 2 is getting as much as humanly possible, I think the player base will be unsatisfied even if ArenaNet are making the correct decision long term to try and get something else going. This information, compounded with the fact that there is not an expansion for Guild Wars 2 and no concrete word on when there will next be an expansion, simply that the devs still believe it might be possible, people are beginning to look at Guild Wars 2 as a has-been experience. They shouldn't. There are active MMOs, even to this day, that launched way before Guild Wars 2 that are very successful. Any number of contemporary MMOs in the West have been able to turn themselves around several years in and reach new heights that they never had before. Guild Wars 2 is still full of all of that potential, but these layoffs and this murky water to do with the expansion and the new Icebrood saga not necessarily feeling like an expansion replacement as the devs so clearly want it to be, has left a very dark cloud over many people's heads indeed. Let's just hope that whatever these other projects ArenaNet has are really good and they'll have something for us soon. Either that or at least an expansion for Guild Wars 2. That would be nice. Thanks. So there you go, guys. That's my current thoughts about the game's biggest issues, like the serious talking points. There are a lot of other little things that we could go into, but as far as what the game is, what it's trying to do, that's really where I sit after having followed it for 8 years. I'd like to be clear that these aren't necessarily new revelations to me. My opinion hasn't suddenly soured overnight and now I felt like I wanted to rant about it. I just wanted to do a discussion and kind of lay the state of how I feel about everything, and I know we'll get some great comments coming from this. So until next time, take it easy.